Hello, it's Stephanie Lemek here with the Wounded Workforce, and I am so excited to have another amazing group of experts joining us for this month's conversation about toxic stress in the workplace. I'd love to kick us off and have each of our panelists introduce themselves. I'll go ahead and start with Jackie. Jackie, can you introduce yourself?
So lovely to be here. My name is Jackie Hazan. I'm the CEO and founder of Hazan Consulting, a firm focused on strategic HR consulting and executive coaching.
Amazing. So great to have you, Jackie. We will go ahead and kick it off next to Liz. Liz, welcome.
Hi, I'm Liz Moeller, based in Los Angeles, and I do a lot of executive and career development coaching. And I'm just excited to tackle this challenge with everybody.
Amazing. Great to have you, Liz. Thanks for joining us. Jen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Fox. I am calling in from Princeton, New Jersey, where the sun is finally shining today.
Woo!
I am a career HR professional. I work on coaching, consulting, and my passion is around building resilience in individuals and workplaces. So I'm so excited to dig into this topic today.
Amazing. We love talking about resilience. So great to have you. Jessica, wrap us up.
Last but not least, right?
Of course, yes.
I'm Jessica Weiss, and what I do is I teach people about finding more happiness, satisfaction, and fulfillment at work. Also in life, but mostly in work. And I do that through giving keynotes. I do consulting, and I also do a whole bunch of coaching. So this topic is right on point for me. So I am too super excited to talk about it. And Jen, just like you, I'm in New York City and we could actually smell a little spring in the air today. So it was like a huge win, right?
It's something about that sunshine. It just makes all the difference, right? And so
Absolutely.
glad to have you back, Jessica. Jessica joined us on, I think, our third ever panel with the Wounded Workforce. So great to have you back and bring your insights to this conversation.
Thank you.
Like all of our panels, I love to start from a place of shared understanding. So I want to provide a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today, and then I will start asking some questions and kick it over to our amazing panelists to share their insights. So, when we talk about toxic stress, it refers to the prolonged exposure to challenging life experiences, overwhelming situations, or adverse conditions that can have detrimental effects on individuals' mental and physical well being. In the workplace, toxic stress can manifest as heightened and sustained pressure, often resulting from factors such as excessive workload, poor management, lack of support, and hostile or toxic organizational culture. This chronic stress can negatively impact employees' mental health, job satisfaction, and overall performance. And it leads to one of the most dreaded words in corporate America, burnout. So, as we dive into this conversation, very happy to talk about this and learn a little bit more. I would love to kick off and hear from each of you. Why is this topic important to you, either personally, professionally, or both? Jump in for whoever's ready.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I think for me, both personally and professionally, I was an HR practitioner in-house for most of my career. Um, I saw the impact of toxic stress on the individuals, on teams, on the overall organization, and not fully aware of it myself, but was experiencing the impact of toxic stress. And it really took stepping back to be able to understand just how deeply I was impacted by it on a personal level, and ultimately how much the organizations that I worked for were harmed by the impact of toxic stress without really having the language or the tools to be able to talk about what was being experienced collectively and individually and support and change the environment for the better for everybody.
Jackie, I can just echo all of that. I would say that, similarly, 25 years, in and out of HR, I have supported and witnessed it. I'm, I guess, humble enough to realize I'm sure I've contributed to it, and have absolutely experienced it. And I will say I'm a survivor at this point. And I think for me, there isn't much of a differentiation between how it shows up professionally or personally, because as I've come to be on the experiencing end, I've had that really profound lesson that when it comes to toxic stress, there's no line, because we bring it to the rest of our life, whether we like to think we can keep it at work or not. So I do think it's a deeply personal issue, even if it originates in the workplace.
Yeah, and I'll just go on with that idea also, Jen, because my work focuses so much around helping people find more satisfaction at work. But this idea that we can isolate what we feel at work and it doesn't cascade throughout our entire life is a complete facade. And we all know that. So this idea of toxic stress, just like everybody else, and probably everybody else walking the planet, right? I have certainly felt it. I have certainly lived it. And in my work, it is certainly one of the most profound, most present obstacles for people to actually start to enjoy their work. This idea that on a daily basis, they're confronted with mental stress and every physical symptom that flows from that, and every mental block that flows from that. So yes, this is omnipresent from a personal perspective and certainly in my work. So I'm excited to dig in.
And I'll wrap it up to say kudos to everybody that's here that's coaching, because having coached people in career transition specifically for over 25 years, most of my clients come to me at breakpoint and they'll tell me I'm either going to quit or get fired because I'm right here on the edge and something's got to give. And so the first thing that I try to do with my clients is help to lower that stress and pull them off the cliff, so that they realize that they need to take control of what's going on in their lives completely, and not just, throw the baby out with the bathwater and just quit, or go to the push to a break point and burn out and get fired. So it's definitely a hot topic. And then working with executives that are feeling the pressure from the C-suite down to them to pressure it back down to their people, and acknowledging that they're feeling the squeeze. So this is a hot topic. So looking forward to digging in.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I think about career transitions, for sure, especially career transitions in the last 4 or so years, that toxic stress, that burnout, that breaking point you mentioned, Liz, has absolutely been something I've been hearing folks talk about quite a bit. So, on that note, what are key indicators of toxic stress at work, and how does it differ from regular kind of workplace stress? We all experience some level of stress. Some level of stress can be good, but what, are the indicators for toxic stress?
I'm actually I'm writing about this partly because I was preparing for this conversation today, and so I'm writing an article about this on my Substack. And I learned this phenomenon. I think it was in Fierce Conversations, a course I took years ago, and the phenomenon of gradually then suddenly, and it really stuck with me at the time, but only today did I actually, where did that even come from? And it came from Ernest Hemingway in the novel The Sun Also Rises, and the question was, how do you go bankrupt? And he says 2 ways: gradually, then suddenly. And when I learned about this, I thought there is no single good, point in my life or bad point in my life that does not follow this path. So you can think on the good side, you gradually, fall in love, and then suddenly you're committed or married or whatever. And the inverse is also true. You gradually start to grow apart, and then suddenly you're not together. And I think that when you bring that to this topic and look for indicators, they're unique. I mean, this, as varied as the workplace and all the individuals in it, I don't think we could come up with, like even a top 10 list of like, what does toxic stress look like? How do I watch for it? Because I think if we could, it wouldn't exist. Especially, I mean, HR people are so committed to doing this, but it's those covert and unidentifiable small little things that gradually add up over time. And I like to use the analogy of like the dashboard on a car and thinking about getting in tune with our early warning indicators. And so, you know, Liz, as you said, people come to you when they're like burnt out or they're ready to quit, right? That's like the equivalent of the car being broken down on the side of the road. So I think the trick is how do we figure out, and it has to be on an individual level, how do we figure out what the individual early warning indicators are and create the space for people to show up and be vocal about what those are, and then, or as an organization, create the space and figure out how we address those. But I do think it has to start at the individual level and being really in tune to what those are, because they just vary from person to person.
Yeah, I think the individual aspect of it is such a key point, because it's so important to realize that what stresses one person out is going to excite and stress out somebody in a motivational, positive way. So you've got your eustress, which is positive, which gets people excited and engaged and ready to work even harder, and then other people respond, you know, in a very different reaction with overwhelm or confusion or frustration. And so acknowledging that stress is a part of life, and that stress can actually be good for you, and it can motivate you to work a little harder and dig in. But at some point you get to what I call that tipping point where it becomes too much. And it might be a client of mine who says, I've been working for 10 years at this company or 15 years at this company. I used to engage and love it, and I love the stress, and I ran on the adrenaline. And now I've been promoted up and I don't want to do this anymore. And so stress can kind of come gradually, and then all of a sudden they realize this isn't where I want to be. So taking the time to think about what the individual person is looking for. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jen, that it is very unique to each person, certainly unique to each individual. But in my work, there have been a few sort of signals that when I hear people say a few things is when like the ding, 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 or the dashboard, right, goes off in my mind that, okay, this is actually an inordinate, like this is an unhealthy stress. It's not the good kind of stress, Liz, that you were talking about that like motivates us and keeps us going. So I find in my work, when people come to me with this inability to make a decision, they are so stressed that they literally cannot make a decision. And they come to me and they're like, Jessica, I don't know what to do. I know that I'm overwhelmed, I'm paralyzed, and I have an inability to make a decision. If you can't make the decisions that you need to make at work, your stress has now crossed over into a place where we're in a toxic situation. So for me, that's the first one. And there's another one that's sort of really common that comes up. And it's this idea about disengagement, right? So the stress has become so much, so overwhelming, so overbearing that they have just completely disconnected. It's like apathy, they don't care. So when I hear about an inability to make a decision and this idea that I'm just completely disengaged and I really just don't even care anymore, that's to me, that's two signals that we've crossed into a danger zone with the stress. It's no longer a good kind of stress.
I think so many amazing perspectives shared here, right? And what I reflect on is there's no one necessarily trigger or standard that I see. I think to Liz's point, it can be highly individual. To Jessica's point, there are broad strokes that you can look at and say, this generally is a marker of toxic stress and toxic environments. And so often what I see are individuals who are just in a state of overwhelm and shutdown, right? They are chronically stressed out. They are sleeping through the weekends. They are unable to focus and make decisions because they are in a state of stress that is sustained. And when it is a state of stress that is sustained and it is not choiceful, right? They don't choose to engage in the stressful environment. I think that choice for me is a really impactful measure. That's when we're dealing with toxic stress.
Can I add one thing to that too, that I guess I'll speak personally here, but I do think for whatever reason, I'm surrounded by a fairly large number of what I call over-functioning professional women. So on the disengagement, I think that and total the decision making that resonates so deeply for sure. And for me, that those two things came at like when I already tipped. What I find with myself, and I think with some other people I've supported, is those of us who have that sort of grind it out we can do this. I'm going to prove it. I mean, come hell or high water, almost go into an over functioning mode when there's this toxic stress in the environment because we try to fix it. I was in a situation where, I mean, I could show you on my Google Drive, I have documents with like strategies about how I was going to like maneuver, like games I could make up and strategies for how to survive. And if I only did this to this person and had this conversation. And so I think that there's kind of both sides, and some of that early warning could also be someone who is working over and above, working harder than ever, and really trying to, like, you almost desperate to try to fix the situation. You know, I think, which, you know, it sounds like we're all sort of saying it's like it's individual, which sometimes can make it really hard to put your finger on what it is.
I think these such good points. This is such already an amazing conversation. And I want to add on to an amazing analogy, Jen, about the, indicator lights on the car. We all got to take our car in for self-maintenance too, before any lights are coming on. This, maybe I'm thinking about it because I need to take mine in, but it's just, what's that self-maintenance aspect as well before, we get to the point where our indicator lights are going off, and, how can we incorporate, self-maintenance to help prevent toxic stress, or, help recover from toxic stress that we may be experiencing. So as we look at organization, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I wrote a post about this on LinkedIn last week with a little visual, because self-care, it's like one of these love-hate things, because it's just, you need more self-care, and I remember when my kids were young, I have 3 kids sort of back to back, and I was like, shut up. If I had time for self-care, I would do it. And I learned it wasn't like what was being marketed to me as self-care. It wasn't the pedicure, like the hurry up and go relax. And what I shared last week was sort of this chart I've made for myself of like self-care when things are broken down, right? That's like calling a trusted friend. It's like getting away and getting out of the situation, right? Self-care, I sort of have like a red, yellow, green. So what does self-care look like when it's sort of those early warning indicators? It's like getting outside, exercising, taking a nap. And then what's the self-care when everything is great? And I think that's what you're talking about there, Stephanie, because oftentimes we wait until like everything's broken down, and then it's like, what do we possibly do to bring ourselves back and take care of ourselves? So it's that proactive self-care. It's the everyday maintenance, which I think is the hardest thing to do because it doesn't feel urgent. We're so programmed to be in the like urgent quadrant 1, everything's on fire kind of thing. But it's really that like proactive stuff that I've come to realize, especially in the last year, that is the key to me handling anything that comes my way.
That is so perfect.
Well, and just on a similar note, on the work that I do all around happiness and kind of teaching people more about finding satisfaction at work rather than thinking that work is just something that we need to trudge through and kind of survive. I always say that happiness and finding what your definition of happiness is at work, that's the best preventative measure to toxic stress, right? That's the best preventative measure to burnout. If you can figure out a way to enjoy all of those things before the proverbial like shit hits the fan, you're in a much better place. Like it's like go on a diet before you get diabetes, before you do all these things, take the necessary steps. So I look at my work through that lens of if we can do this before all the bad stuff happens, we'll have a toolkit to deal with it. So that's the same kind of stuff that you're talking about, Jen, because I'm always like, manicure and pedicure ain't gonna solve this problem. Like I wish it would make my life so much easier, but we are way beyond manicure and pedicure.
I think in a very similar vein, Jen and Jessica, one of the things that I talk to my coaching clients a lot about is how can we develop a practice of noticing early, noticing often when our body is starting to relay triggers around stress. Oftentimes we're feeling stress long before it hits a breaking point, right? But we are tuning it out, or we're not attuned to where it's showing up for us, how it's showing up for us. So And developing that practice of doing our own audit, okay, of how am I feeling in this moment, in this day, in this environment, we can understand and begin to talk about, what do I need? What do I need to be a healthy, happy professional in the workplace, a whole human, whether things are totally broken down and I need an overhaul, or things are actually going really well and I just want to have that preventative care and balance and joy in my life to stay in a state of stress that is manageable or absent from stress, even should we get to that point, right? So I find there's real power in developing that auditing or noticing practice.
Well, it just heightens the awareness for the clients of what's in their control and what's not in their control. And so that's something we always want to like bring to the surface of what's really, what can you do to take care of you? And what does that look like? Does it look like a nap? Does it look like speaking up? Does it look like reaching out to a friend or journaling? And so I think we all have tools in our toolkit, but it's going to have to be, what's in it for them? What exactly are they looking for? And how can we lean in and then reflect back to them where these triggers are? And then how are they self-aware enough to make some steps forward to make things better?
This is so perfect. I love this because I think you all like zeroed in on actual self-care. I love Jackie noticing that term, noticing, versus like the self-care that's being marketed to us, especially as women. I think with self-care gets marketed to us to sell us things. And if a massage, if a manicure and a pedicure could solve burnout, I think we would not talk about it nearly as much. For sure, for sure. So great insights. Obviously, organizations play a key role when it comes to toxic stress and burnout in our workplaces. In what way do organizational policies contribute to or alleviate toxic stress in the workplace?
So I always like to take, you're putting my HR hat on for a second. I always like to think that organizations intend to do well by their employees and want to create an environment in which they could be productive, work in a way in which they are supported and their well-being is thought of and cared for. I think so often the processes and the policies just aren't aligned with what the actual experience is on the ground, right? A manager can have an outsized impact on how a whole team experiences stress in the workplace. A working condition can have an outsized impact on stress in the workplace. And there's not always this real intersection of process, policy, and experience. So I think the organizations that are managing this really well are integrating as much as they can those three tiers to be able to look at the holistic experience in the workplace and find processes and policies that support, versus what you may have seen even prevalent more 5 years ago is this well, our process and our policy for mental well-being is we have benefits and it's up to you to utilize them, and if you don't or can't, that's not really the organization's problem. We've solved it through benefits, right? I think a lot more organizations are starting to pull in trauma-informed services, mental health first aiders, et cetera. And I think it's a continued evolution to find what really works and the right balance for the individuals, the teams, and the organization.
Yeah, Gallup had a great statistic recently that said that managers, your team manager, has more of an impact on your mental health than your partner, either equal to or more than your partner, than your doctor. And that to me was a shocking revelation. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, right? Because if you have a manager who's an absolute nightmare, and I don't know if any of you have had that experience, I unfortunately have had that experience. That makes perfect sense because that manager and that person's behavior, the amount of mental space that takes up in your life as a team member is, it's infinite. So I think that there's a critical role for organizations. And then there's another really interesting statistic that came out about organizations where they think they're doing a great job, right? They think they've got the whole thing nailed. And in fact, when you talk to people within the organization, they're like, no, it's actually worse. Like, you think you've put all of these things in place, it's actually worse. So there's a huge disconnect between what's going on, right? Managers have this outsized impact on our mental health and stress in the workplace. And the C-suite and leadership in general feels that they are doing everything possible and everything right. So for me, when I always think about transformational change in an organization, I think that the best way to start is with your team, right? It's let's look at our little house and what we can do here. So while I think it's wonderful when organizations, big organizations launch these major initiatives, I think it's much more meaningful and impactful if you yourself are a manager and you start to make those changes directly on your team. And there are certainly things that we all know the things that managers can do, right, to start to alleviate the stress. And of course, the first one that comes to mind is this idea of listening. And it goes back to what you said, Jackie, around noticing, right? So it's this whole idea of listening. Who knows better than what's happening on your team than your manager? Now, you as a manager have to have the initiative, have to have the want to, right, to actually know what's going on in your team. But I always say leadership doesn't have to be that hard. It's really just a question of not being like a horrible person, right? It's really just a question of being a good person. So if you could figure out, even if you're not a good person, just put on the hat and pretend you're a good person, right? We can actually start to make some change. So when I heard those statistics, I was like, there's something here that really needs to be done. And I think it can start like you and your team can start it, right? And then it spreads. So that's what I think organizations can do. I think it's wonderful when there are initiatives that come down from the very top and when the behavior starts to get modeled. But I don't think a lot of organizations are there yet. And I think that such a huge such a huge thing that we can do with stress is this idea of control, when you feel that you have autonomy over the situation. So if you can start to make the changes within your own team, even if you're not the manager, but you can bring it to the manager, I think that's where change in organizations can really start.
I guess the other, if I were doing my own, I have a dream speech HR version. It would be something along the lines of, I would have a dream that, and speaking of organizations that are, large enough that embedded in every single corporate strategy team would be a people professional. This is not HR having a seat at the table, because HR does now, I think more than ever, have a seat at the table. But it's often at here's the strategy, go figure out how to do it, people. My dream would be that as the strategy is being created, the people person is there, annoyingly. What about this? What about that? Oh, you want to expand internationally? Who is going to do that? So I wholeheartedly agree with it, with the manager level. And I think that that's where we start, sort of from like an intervention perspective, because it's within, I love, Liz, that reminder of like what's in our control and what's not. But I think to cause the systemic change that's needed to get out of this, I think HR policies and procedures are always lagging. And at the speed of change that we're facing right now, usually we're creating a policy because there's already some crisis. And so then by the time the policy goes through and gets all the approval and gets all the communication and everybody rises up and protests against it, it's literally not even meeting the needs of what the original thing was anyway. And so I think if we can, the Staples easy button, I always wish there was like a pause button. We just like, okay, pause. Let's stop and assess what we have. What's our capacity to deliver? What's the impact? What are the trade-offs on the business goals and the cost on our people that are going to achieve those goals? Can we actually do these things? And so if we're assessing and then we measure the progress of our, like, show me a KPI report on like a quarterly basis that has the health of our people. I know some organizations do it, but not everybody. And if we were measuring the same thing as like our revenue dollars, as our health of our people in that sort of balanced scorecard view, I don't think we would get to the point where burnout is just like the normal thing and everybody's, quitting their job. So I don't know. I'm optimistic that maybe one day we'll get there, but I do think it has to start at the very, very beginning of the strategic planning process.
I love that because there have been so many times in my HR career where I've been, you know, thinking strategically, well, what will this do to our people? And then it's like, well, okay, Steph. It's like, all right, Stephanie, like whatever. And then it happens, and it's like you have your, little "see, I told you so" moment, but it already happened. So that harm, that stress is already there. So like the "told you so" doesn't really feel very good because you haven't prevented these challenges or tackled them in a way proactively, like you said, instead of reacting with a policy. I think that that's so interesting. That's such an important distinction. I think that strategic voice versus seat at the table. I like how you frame that a lot. So we're talking about managers and leaders, and when we think about, organizations and how they can approach or help mitigate toxic stress, how can leaders, how can managers create cultures that promote mental well-being and mitigate toxic stress for their employees, whether it's, for full organizations or even just for, starting with their individual teams?
It's a great question. And just last week, I was asked to speak at a conference, and the theme of the conference was to bring a coaching culture to the organization. And so what they needed to do was they needed to recognize that managers and directors and people that have been promoted up probably were very, very good at the job they were hired to do. And because they've been there for whether it was tenure or an area of expertise, they've been promoted up, possibly to a position that involves managing other people. And so now they need some management skills. And that's one of my Lizisms, is that people don't quit companies, they quit people. So all of a sudden your boss has no business being a boss. They're not a people person. They're an ideas person, or they're a things person. And all of a sudden they're managing you. And so I thought it was really valuable that this organization said, oh my gosh, we've got a lot of leaders that could benefit from some leading, coaching advice. And let's just give them some coaching wisdom. Let's give them some coaching ideas. Let's train them a little bit on this. And then let's offer in-depth, through the wellness organization, they can take coaching classes, or let's give them a coach so that they've got a sounding board or somebody that they can turn to when they're having a quote HR issue. And a lot of managers would prefer to just pass the HR issue down to somebody in HR or up to somebody in HR. But the reality is, if those managers don't learn some of those communication tools and some of those coaching tools, they're just going to have conflict upon conflict. So certainly, embedding the idea that we want to have a culture of coaching, that we want to embrace the core values of the organization and give these managers the tools to coach, that's one step in the right direction.
And I think building on that, Liz, I love introducing coaching concepts to organizations is something that I think is hugely, hugely impactful as we think about creating the sort of environments that support employee well-being, high performance, et cetera. I think in addition to that, being able to have a combination of things like regular listening, right, which I know Jessica mentioned, listening in multiple ways at multiple levels of the organization, HR teams that are strategically oriented to be able to interpret that data and recommend action plans within the organization to leadership that has appropriate resourcing behind it, right? I think that's a really important part of the ecosystem. But I think also along with that is articulating what are our cultural norms, what are the guardrails of what your experience should look like, the rough edges of what behavior should look like in the organization, so that if something is happening outside of that norm, right, you have a particularly toxic manager, we have the language then to be able to say, well, actually, this experience is dissonant from what we say we want it to be organizationally. And then we have the systems and the processes for those employees to have an outlet, right? I think that's where there's real power organizationally. And especially if you can couple that with a coaching culture, it just really unlocks potential to start moving away from this toxic stress and the burnout that you could see as a result.
I love the question when you get to this sort of like tactically, because I often go to, events like this and I get inspired and there's a lot of sort of like preaching to the choir, and then I leave and I'm like, okay, but now what do I go do? And it's not like call EAP, Jackie, like you're talking about, just sort of throw the benefits. Here's our EAP number. If you need it, have at it. There's three specific things that I would call out that I would say I think are more on the tactical side. One, I think actually the pandemic pushed us into this space, but I think we've gotten away from it. I think a lot of organizations really leaned into the sort of check-in and the well-being sort of thing. You kind of probably a little bit overdone, right? Every meeting was started with like, how are we? And, a lot of that type of stuff. And I think it was along the right track to start to create the space for having people show up and share with them, with the rest of the group or with their manager, what was going on. I think a lot of us have gotten away from that now. It's like back to business. One of the HR tools that I've used, I think that's amazing, has in the one-on-one starting program that the employee goes in and writes in their agenda item and the manager writes in theirs, but the employee also does this sort of well-being check. And I think there's 5 questions on a sliding scale, like, how am I feeling about work this week? How am I, whatever. And as a manager, what I would come to find is everybody sort of has their norm, right? Some people are always higher raters. And so it wasn't so much about the score, it was the relative score week to week. And so I may have a list of a zillion agenda things I want to get through, but if that sliding scale was like moved a little bit to the left, you can be damn sure it's the first and only thing that we might talk about that week, because nothing else matters. So I think some type of well-being check-in that's authentic and consistent, I think is critical. I think the second thing, I just recently got trained in mental health first aid. We talk so much about manager. I would love for every person, parent, teacher, caregiver, leader to do it. It's the world we're in right now. And I think we need to be able to, when we talk about, equipping managers with things, there's having the coaching conversations and everything, as you've mentioned. And then I think there's some real practical things that most of us who are of the age that we're in a leadership position now weren't raised to certainly talk about or have any awareness of what are the indicators of substance abuse, of anxiety and depression and things like that. And the more we can get educated and normalize it, the more we'll be able to lean in on it. And then I think the third thing is related. I think it's being able to have leadership from the top down normalize the hard times, but not only in the times when we're like shit's gone off the rails. It's like, not like here's a hard time and therefore we're doing layoffs, but like in your all hands meetings, instead of always being, the bells and whistles and everything's going to be great, let's talk about what's struggling right now, which things aren't going so well. And the more we can sort of have leaders model that it's okay to have those ups and downs and we're all sort of balancing those things, I think it just creates a space that we don't only talk about the bad things when they're like really, really bad. And I do think a lot of that comes from modeling. And I don't think in general executive teams are very good at that. They're usually doing the sort of sales pitchy kind of thing, or the, yeah, things aren't going well type of stuff. So I think there's somewhere on that paradigm that we can get a little bit more authentic about sharing our struggles.
Yeah, I mean, I love those tips, Jen. And I'm like a huge proponent of always getting like super tactical and practical. That's so much of what I believe in. So I'm just going to add one small bit to what you said. And it kind of is in keeping with what you said previously, Liz. So many managers get to their position because they were good at their previous job, and then their new job has nothing to do with what they were good at. And now they're put in charge with they require a whole set of new skills that most of those people don't have, nor do organizations usually even offer that kind of training to those kind of people. So I give lots of talks and I run workshops, and there's always the skeptics in the room who are like, oh yeah, here she is talking about happiness at work. Come on, like, we're here for work. We're not going to talk happiness. Like, this is not the time and the place. And of course I disagree and meet the skeptics head on. But I think a really effective, like, practical tool to deal with skeptics in the room around this whole issue of toxic stress and burnout and whatever it is everyone likes to talk about purpose at work, right? And this idea that when we understand our purpose, it's we're aligned with our work, and it sort of creates a buffer zone because if you have a greater purpose, you can sort of weather those storms. I find purpose to be really difficult to wrap my brain around. I think and I think it's another one of those skeptical words at work. When you meet with the pessimists, they're like, purpose, come on, I'm here to, like, I'm doing a P&L, I need to hit my quotas, like, leave me alone with purpose. But I think an alternative way to think about it is mattering. This idea around how does your job matter? And I think that you can look at that from like three very distinct perspectives. So how does your job matter to you? Right? What is it about your work that matters to you? And that is just a very personal kind of introspective thing. But this is where I think it really comes into play for managers. It's understanding the skill of explaining to your team members how their work matters, how their work matters to them, how their work matters to the team, how their work matters to the organization. And that is a much easier thing to train people on, because it's much more tangible than purpose. And B, it really kind of allows skeptics to step into this shoes of the world that they don't really believe should exist in the world of work, because this is really very specific. This is why your work matters. You did XYZ project because we needed to get to this new place. And while we might have abandoned that project, your work still matters because you have the skills now to take us in another direction when something else happens. Like, mattering is a very practical way to speak. And I think it's a really great tool for managers and those hyper skeptical managers who feel, they don't want to talk about it. But I think it's a great tactic to sort of create the buffer from toxic stress.
I love that. I love that. And I think, mattering is, like you said, Jessica, it's easier for us to wrap our heads around it. It's also a key aspect of empowerment when we think of empowerment as a principle of trauma-informed workplaces. Such a great point. In the spirit of keeping with, tactical, what can you do now things, what can individual employees do when they need to wave the yellow or the red flag when they are experiencing toxic stress, or feel there's, toxic stress or the, oncoming burnout for themselves or their teams? What advice do you have for individuals who want to kind of wave that flag, but also want to avoid, fear of retribution or negative impacts from, saying, hey, we need help, or hey, I need help?
I think I'll start where you finished, because I would say there was a time when my answer to that would be speak up, use your voice. And I realized that works sometimes, and sometimes that really doesn't work, which is unfortunate, but it is a reality. And so I guess what I would say is go to someone you can trust who's removed from the situation. You don't have to have a paid coach. Someone who is on the outside, who can understand the situation and reflect back to you and remind you that you are at choice. Every action you take, if you're in a situation like this, you have a choice. It's just each choice has a different set of consequences. And some of them you may or may not be able, they may be like out of reach. If you say, I couldn't go 2 weeks without a paycheck, your strategy around handling this situation may be entirely different than someone says, you know what, if I took a year off, I would be fine. So I think a lot of times when we say speak up and use your voice, there's a privilege implied in that you're in an environment that can handle your truth. And I've come to realize that that's not always the case, even when you think that it exists. So go to someone that you can trust and really try to get the circumstances outside of you and lay out your options. It's usually not an option 1 or 2. There's almost always an option 3. And just think through that. What are the consequences if I do these? And then I think when you do it, it's being willing to, I always use this sort of phrase like new data, now what? Take a step, new data, now what's the next step? And it's literally one step at a time, because ultimately you're dealing with how other people can react to your truth. And that's completely, Liz, to your point, outside of your control. Mm-hmm. You can be as professional and pragmatic as you want, and it's outside of your control. But how they react, now you get to choose what's my next very best step. And I think if you have those people in your corner that can remind you of who you are, what's important to you, reflect back your well-being, I think it's essential to get through these really, really hard situations.
That was beautifully said, truly. I don't know that I have too much to add other than really be honest with yourself about what the dynamics of your working environment is and what you need to feel safe, as safe as possible, as you're considering the options and the pathways and working to excavate them.
Yeah, and I'll just add one small point here is I tend to go very practical. We need friends at work, and this is precisely why, right? This is precisely those moments where you go to somebody that you can trust. It's not necessarily your manager, it's not necessarily it, but it's someone who can completely understand the situation, the externals and also the internals. So an essential part of dealing with this kind of thing is having and one friend at work is going to be sufficient to kind of get you through it, right? We only need one person to listen to us, and you even said this, Jen, right, to remind you of who you are and what's important to you. So I think that instead of thinking about what manager, what leader, what HR person I can go to, I think that this is really one of those moments where you need a friend at work.
It's amazing. We are already almost out of time. Our hour always goes by so quickly. And I always love to wrap up with a question to each of our panelists on if someone wants to learn more about toxic stress, about burnout, about, how we can live better lives at work, what would you recommend, for podcast, book, reading, training, any recommendations you would offer to our listeners?
Well, one of the tools that I use when clients come to me and they're at kind of that break point, or they're managers and they're feeling that squeeze, is I do follow what Jen and Jessica were saying about trust. What is it that's really true to who you are? And so I'll help them sort of reframe the know, like, trust, which hopefully they already understand how important it is to know what they know and figure out what they like, but try to go a third layer deeper to answer what I call that $1 million question, which is, well, what exactly are you looking for? And so I use a tool, I use a values tool, because sometimes they just don't know. They've been just following along for such a long time, and they were fine initially, but now they're burned out. Or they thought things were going well, but now it's just not sitting right. And it could be just their life has changed. They got married, they have small children, or they're getting close to retirement. So I always say to them, let's take some time to sort of unpack the answer to that really tough question. And like we said, it's hard to do it by yourself. So where is that trusted friend? Where's that person that can help pull that information out of you? And maybe that friend doesn't have the tools at their resource to pull it out of them. So using some sort of a values activity or a values tool can really help put things front and center and help people make a more clear decision or get them going in a better direction.
So shameless plug, I will say, I talk about this stuff all the time, not directly in the context of, I don't directly hit on stress. I much more talk about it in this preventative way. But on my Instagram and on my LinkedIn, I'm constantly putting up videos all around really specific tools and tactics that we can all use that are really usable. Most of them are free, which is a joy, around how you can sort of squeeze out the joy in your life to counter all this, negative stuff that we all deal with on a regular basis. So if you want to find me on Instagram, I am the Jessica Weiss. And I put out videos and tips and tools on the regular.
And if you haven't watched Jessica's TED Talk, what are you doing? Get on it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think every woman should have a "the" in front of their name. Can we just do that?
That
just feels like something that should be done. So good for you.
Thank you,
Liz. I was going to say the same thing, and I think about I've got three things here to offer. One is something I've used in the past forever, which is a values assessment. I use the Brene Brown values, and she forces you to get down to 2. And it's like painful because there's so many things you value. And I got mine down to freedom and growth. And those are the guardrails through which I live my life. Every big decision comes down to that. Can I do this thing and have those 2 values in play? And every single time I align with those, it works out. So values, I just double down on that suggestion, Liz. Something that's a little bit more new to me and a book. I'm a big book podcast. The algorithm has me figured out because I feel like this is all I get fed. So it's like the water I swim in. I'm loving this book right now. It's called The 5 Resets. Rewire your brain and body for less stress and more resilience. You can see my my tags. Highly recommend. And then on the side of sort of what's coming for me, as I said, I've taken my experience from being the supporter, contributor to, and victim of toxic stress, and am similar to you, Jessica, coming through the happiness lens. I'm coming through the resilience lens. So again, through my LinkedIn and my Substack, I write daily and weekly on dismantling toxic resilience, which I believe is what, especially as women, we've been taught, which is like, get back up, suck it up, make things more comfortable for the rest of us. We don't want to hear about it. And there is another way. So I've got a group coaching program coming up, an online course, and some really exciting partnerships around building a resilient organization. So there's a lot to come this year. I'm so passionate about this. So Stephanie, I think when you sent out the email for this, I think I responded in about 32.1 seconds because I was like, this is my topic. So thank you all. I have just absolutely loved hearing all of your ideas and your perspective today.
And I'll round this out. What I would share is I'm also a big book person. I love flipping through a physical book, especially when I'm commuting or traveling. One that I just finished and really enjoyed was Language in the Pursuit of Happiness. It offers a really interesting lens on just the generative power of our conversations to impact positively or negatively our mood, how we interact with each other, how we remember conversations, how we experience tactically the world around us, and what a powerful opportunity to be at choice in the language that we use and understand and make new observations about our experience as we start to unpack and really get choiceful about how we're interacting with language. So I just thought it was a really interesting take on how do I show up differently, or how do I be more aware of the language at use in the workplace that may be causing some of these more negative emotions that lead to stress ultimately in the workplace. And thank you to this group. It's been an amazing experience being here today.
Absolutely. I can never stop asking this question, even though my husband hates how often my bookshelf grows after all of these amazing recommendations. But my to be read list is always stacked. So I really appreciate it. And I agree. This has been such a beautiful conversation. Thank you all so much for your time and your expertise. Make sure and follow these fabulous individuals. Like each of them said, follow them here on LinkedIn, on Instagram as well. And next month, we will have another wonderful panel coming to you live. And until next time, I hope you all are resilient and avoid as much toxic stress as possible. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you.